Tear his sign down. This is our lake now. That's what she screamed while her contractor ripped my private property sign out of the soil and threw it into the bed of a pickup truck like it was garbage. I stood at my own gate watching 20 workers pour concrete pylons into the shoreline of a lake my grandfather built by hand in 1952. She had called it a community amenity in 3 separate press releases. She had never once asked my permission. She had never once checked who held the deed. That's the thing about people drunk on HOA power. They start believing the rules they write apply to land they don't own. What Diane Keller did not know, what she could not have imagined standing there in her linen blazer with her clipboard, was that I am the licensed dam operator for that lake. And every drop of water in it answers to a single valve on my property that only I know how to operate. So I didn't argue with her that day. I drove home, opened my logbook, and started a timeline. Because some fights you don't win by being loud. You win them by being ready. My name is Wyatt Hollister, and the lake the HOA tried to steal from me has a name. My grandfather called it Junebug Pond, after my grandmother June. He built it himself in the spring of 1952, hauling clay by mule, pouring the spillway concrete out of a wheelbarrow, shaping it by hand the way men of his generation built things, with patience and without contractors. He bought the surrounding 180 acres in Bonner County, Idaho, with money he'd saved working 12-hour days at a sawmill for 14 years. He left it to my father. My father left it to me. I'm 58 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer with the Army Corps of Engineers, specializing in earth dam design and hydraulic structures. I hold a state dam safety license that fits in a wallet sleeve. I know exactly how much water moves through a 6-inch siphon line at full draw. I know exactly how long it takes to empty an 18-acre impoundment when the spring inflow is cut off at the source. That knowledge would matter considerably before this story was finished. I retired 4 years ago to take care of my wife, June, pancreatic cancer. We made it 11 months together after the diagnosis. She wanted to spend her final days at the lake, and we made that happen. She's buried in a small clearing under a young white pine on the south slope, where the morning sun hits the water first. On clear October mornings, the light comes across the water at an angle that makes everything look like something my grandfather might have painted if he'd been that kind of man instead of the kind who built things with his hands. After June passed, my daughter Hannah moved to Boise for college. The lake house went quiet in a way that took months to get used to. Then 2 summers ago, the developer arrived. A construction company out of Coeur d'Alene clear-cut 110 acres of pine forest on the parcel directly north of my line. Within 14 months, a gated subdivision called Lakeshore Pines Estates had risen where elk used to bed down. 42 custom homes averaging $1.6 million, all of them oriented to overlook Junebug Pond. My grandfather's pond. The HOA was incorporated before the first house sold. Their president was a woman named Diane Keller. She and her husband Tom moved into the largest of the 42 homes, a 4,000-square-foot timber frame structure with floodlights that lit up half my shoreline at night. Tom Keller, I would later learn, sat on the Bonner County Planning Commission. Diane carried herself like someone who had never once been told no, and had therefore concluded that no was not a word that applied to her. She drove a white Range Rover with a vanity plate that read, Lake Q, wore linen blazers over yoga pants, and kept her sunglasses on indoors. The first letter came in June, on Lakeshore Pines letterhead. It welcomed me to the neighborhood, 4 years after I had already lived there for 31 years. It informed me that Junebug Pond would be listed in the new community amenity package as the Lakeshore Pines Reflection Lagoon. It asked me to remove my private dock, which had stood on those pilings since 1978, so the HOA could harmonize the shoreline aesthetic. I read it twice. I poured a cup of coffee. I drove the letter into town, made 3 copies at the library, and put one in a binder I labeled in pencil on the spine. The binder was thin then. It would not stay thin. The marina construction began the week I drove to Boise to help my daughter move into her sophomore year apartment. I left on a Thursday morning with my truck loaded with her grandmother's dishes and a bookshelf I'd built over the winter. I told her I'd be back in 3 days. I stayed an extra night because she asked. We watched an old movie about a fishing boat. She fell asleep with her head on my shoulder for the first time since she was 7. I drove home Sunday morning with the windows down and the radio on, playing something country and quiet. The Bitterroot Mountains going gold in the early light. I knew something was wrong before I saw the lake. I could hear it from a half-mile out. Heavy equipment, diesel engines, the rhythmic clank of a pile driver. By the time I crested the rise, I could see what they had done. A construction crew of about 20 men was working on my shoreline. A barge with a crane sat in the middle of the pond. They had already driven 6 concrete pylons into the bed of my grandfather's lake. A bulldozer had carved a 100-foot access ramp into the eastern bank, where the slope used to be carpeted in lupine every spring. A modular gazebo, partially assembled, sat on the gravel where my mailbox used to stand. My private property sign was leaning sideways in the dirt. Diane Keller stood at the gate in a coral linen blazer holding a clipboard. I stopped my truck 20 feet short, climbed out slowly, and walked up. My dog stayed in the cab with a low growl in his throat. "Mr. Hollister," Diane said, with the tone of someone greeting a confused child. "I left you 3 notices. The board voted unanimously. We're proceeding with the marina installation as approved by the county." "This is private property," I said. She offered a small, theatrical sigh. "We've executed a shared-use easement. Your dock will be incorporated into the community structure. The board has graciously left your access intact." She handed me a thin manila folder. Inside was a single page calling itself a shared-use easement agreement. It was signed by Diane Keller as HOA president, by Tom Keller as Planning Commission liaison, and by a notary I didn't recognize. There was no signature from me. There was no signature from any prior owner of my parcel. Here is what every homeowner in this country needs to understand, and what I want you to remember from this story, even if you forget everything else. A document is not an easement just because it calls itself one. An easement requires a signed grantor, a recording in the county registry, and the consent of the actual property owner, or a court order, or a condemnation under eminent domain. None of those things had happened. If you didn't sign it, if a judge didn't order it, and if the government didn't condemn it, then it is not real. It does not matter how much official letterhead sits at the top of the page. I didn't explain any of that to Diane. I folded the page, slid it into my jacket pocket, and looked at the pile driver sitting in the middle of my grandfather's pond. "How much is this project costing?" I asked. She smiled like I'd asked the time. $2.2 million. The board approved a special assessment. Each home contributed $48,000. "We are building something this neighborhood deserves." I nodded once. I turned around. I walked back to my truck. I didn't slam the door. I didn't raise my voice. I drove the half-mile back to the house, locked the gate behind me, and walked down to the spillway. I stood there for a long time, listening to the diesel engines on the far side of the trees. Then I went inside, opened the floor safe in my office, and pulled out a green-bound folder my grandfather had labeled in his own hand. Junebug Construction and Title, 1948 to 1952. Inside were the original deed, the original Idaho Department of Water Resources dam construction permit, the spillway design schematic, and a photograph of my grandfather standing next to the open valve of the emergency drawdown siphon. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table. I started the timeline. That night, I drafted the first records request to Bonner County. Longhand, steady print, the way my grandfather wrote everything that mattered. I asked for the construction permits issued for the Lakeshore Pines Marina. I asked for the names of every commissioner who had voted on those permits. I asked for the engineering reports submitted in support. I asked for the full bid package and any contracts awarded. If they had built a marina on my lake, I wanted to know who they had paid to look the other way. The next morning, I was at the county clerk's office at 7:45, first person at the counter when it opened. I handed the request to a woman named Margaret, who had been clerking there since the Reagan administration. She read it twice, looked at me over her glasses, and said, "Wyatt, you sure you want to open this one?" I told her I was. She filed it that morning. Diane Keller had $2.2 million of someone else's money in the water. I had a green folder, a steady hand, and a valve nobody on her side knew existed. As far as I was concerned, that was a fair fight. 6 days after the confrontation at my gate, I drove down to my dock at sunrise to check the water gauge, something I did every morning, recording the level in a small green notebook I kept in the boathouse. My father's aluminum boat was gone. A 1989 14-foot Lund with a Mercury 25-horse outboard, which had sat under a canvas cover on that dock for as long as I had lived there. The cover was folded neatly and set on the dock planks, the way someone leaves things when they want to demonstrate they are being orderly and reasonable while doing something completely unreasonable. A yellow notice was taped to the boathouse door. Unauthorized vessel, Lakeshore Pines Estates Marina Association. Vessels not registered with the Marina office are subject to impoundment. Release fee, $1,250. I felt something cold move up the back of my neck. I took the notice off the door, folded it once, and put it in the green notebook. Then I walked the long way around the eastern shoreline through the cedar grove until I came out behind the construction site. They had built a temporary fenced pen on what used to be my pasture. Inside it sat my father's Lund, my neighbor Jed Carmichael's pontoon, his wife's birthday gift, a boat she'd had since 2007, and a small kayak I recognized as belonging to the elderly couple who lived in the green cabin past the curve. 3 pieces of private property, none of them owned by Lakeshore Pines. All of them locked behind chain link with a padlock that didn't belong to any of us. I took out my phone. I shot a slow, deliberate video. The pen, the lock, the boats, the yellow notices. I narrated the date, the time, the names of the boat owners, and the GPS coordinates from my phone screen. Then I drove into Sandpoint and made notarized copies at a UPS store. That afternoon, Jed Carmichael came over with a 6-pack and a face the color of brick. Jed is 66, a retired heavy equipment mechanic who ran a logging crew up near Priest Lake for 30 years. He doesn't say much. When he does, he means it. "They took my pontoon," he said. "Diane Keller stood on my dock and pointed while 3 guys lifted it onto a trailer." I poured him a glass of water. "You going to let her keep doing this?" I sat down across from him. The maples outside the window were starting to turn, edges going copper. "I'm building a record," I said. "Every fine, every notice, every act of trespass. When the time is right, I'll deliver all of it at once." He looked at me for a while, then he nodded. "I've got cameras," he said. 12 trail cameras from the bear study I helped run 2 winters back. Motion triggered. You want them? I told him I did. We loaded the cameras into his truck the next morning. By nightfall, I had cameras hidden in the cedar grove, in the boathouse rafters, in the hayloft of the old barn, and on a fence post overlooking the marina pen. Each one tagged with a battery date and a memory card schedule. Each one watching. The fines began arriving 3 days later. Unauthorized use of community waterway, $850. Unauthorized footpath, $400. Then unauthorized canine, $250, because my dog walking on my own gravel driveway apparently violated the Lakeshore Pines Pet Conduct Code, a code I had never agreed to and was not bound by. I filed each notice in the binder and added a new tab. By the second week, she'd written me up for $6,200. By month's end, the figure was over $12,000. Each notice signed in her looping cursive. Each one mailed through the United States Postal Service. Mail fraud is a federal offense when the postal system is used to extort. Every envelope would eventually sit in a federal evidence box with her signature on it. I let her keep mailing them. The afternoon the 12th fine arrived, I drove down to the dock at golden hour and sat on the bench where my wife used to sit. The water was glass, that pale steel color the high Idaho lakes get in early October, and a single loon was calling somewhere out near the island. I took a long breath that smelled like cold stone and pine resin. Then I pulled out my phone and dialed the Idaho Department of Water Resources. I asked for Gabriel Whitcomb, my father's contact from 30 years ago, now back as a consultant. When he picked up, I said, "Wyatt Hollister, Junebug Pond, license number on file. I want to schedule my biennial dam inspection. And I want to talk to you about a developer who's built $2 million of unpermitted structure on the impoundment." The line was quiet for a moment. Then I heard him chuckle, very low. "Wyatt," he said, "I've been waiting for somebody to call me about that pond for a year and a half. Tell me what time tomorrow." I told him 8 in the morning. Then I sat on that bench and watched the loon, and the quiet in my chest started to feel less like grief and more like patience. The marina was finished by the second week of October. What they built was impressive in a vulgar way. A floating concrete pier running 200 feet into the deep water, finger docks branching off to hold 36 slips, a 2-story timber pavilion at the shore end with a wraparound deck and a stone fireplace, and an outdoor bar finished in slate. The gravel ramp had been paved and striped for boat trailers. 6 pole-mounted speakers aimed at the water for what the build documents called shoreline ambiance programming. A wooden archway at the entry road read Lakeshore Pines Marina in burnt-edge lettering. By the contractor's own bid documents, $2.2 million of new construction. Every dollar of it sitting on land that did not belong to Lakeshore Pines Estates. Diane planned a ribbon cutting for the Saturday before Halloween, which she called the Founders Day Soft Open. She rented a 40-foot welcome arch in pearl white and gold. She hired a string quartet from Spokane. She had embossed invitations sent to the entire HOA membership, 3 county commissioners, the editor of the Sandpoint paper, a real estate columnist from Coeur d'Alene, and the Bonner County Sheriff. She did not invite me. I drove down to the foot of the entry road that Saturday afternoon anyway, because Junebug Pond is mine, and there is no day of the year I do not have the right to walk to the water on my own land. A man in a black polo shirt with the Marina logo on the chest stepped out of a folding chair and held up his hand. He had an earpiece in his right ear and a clipboard against his hip. "Sir, this is a private event. You'll need an invitation." "I own the land you're standing on," I said, "from the gate to the water and 300 yards in either direction." Diane saw the exchange from the pavilion deck and walked down with the slow, satisfied stride of someone who has been waiting weeks to make exactly that walk. Cream cashmere sweater, leather riding boots, a wine glass in her hand. "Mr. Hollister," she said, "I'm so glad you came, but this is a members-only event. I'm sure you understand." "I understand the boundary line is 40 feet behind you," I said. "I understand the dock you're standing on rests on land deeded to my family in 1948. She tilted her head. "Mr. Hollister, the board has determined that your interpretation of those documents is in error. We have legal counsel. We have approved permits. We have the support of the Planning Commission." I looked past her at the string quartet on the deck. I looked at the ribbon on the railing. I looked at the well-dressed couples under the gazebo with champagne flutes in their hands. "Enjoy your party, Mrs. Keller," I said. I turned around and walked back to my truck. That evening, sitting at my kitchen table with the green folder open and the binder beside it, I learned that the Sandpoint paper had published a Sunday feature headlined, "Crown Jewel of North Idaho's Newest Lakeside Community." A real estate firm had issued a press release announcing a 40% increase in average home value at Lakeshore Pines, attributable to the marina. The HOA had begun marketing 12 new lots priced at $1.8 million each, with private boat slip access included in every listing. Diane Keller had built her entire empire on the assumption that the water in Junebug Pond would always be where it currently was. My grandfather taught me something sitting on the spillway one summer afternoon when I was 9 years old. He said, Son, every dam is a promise. You make a promise to the water, and the water makes a promise back. The day you forget who's in charge, the water reminds you. I closed the binder. I walked outside. I stood at the spillway in the dark and listened to the lake breathing against the concrete. The siphon valve was 30 feet to my left in the small pump house my grandfather had built in 1953. I had not opened it in 11 years. I knew exactly how to. I did not open it that night. I went back inside and made one more phone call. The first time I'd seen the construction permits in the records request packet, something had caught my attention that I couldn't fully explain yet. The marina permits had been approved on a Monday in March, just 4 business days after the application was filed. Marina permits in Bonner County typically take 90 to 120 days. They require an Army Corps wetlands review, an Idaho Fish and Game riparian assessment, and a public comment period of at least 30 days. This permit had skipped all 3. Every waiver had been signed by the same man on the same day, Tom Keller, Vice Chair of the Bonner County Planning Commission, Diane's husband. I called Margaret at the county clerk's office and asked her one specific question: whether there had been any payments, fee transfers, or fund movements between the marina contractor and any commissioner's known business address in the 6 months preceding the permit approval. She said, "Wyatt, I'm going to need to call you back from a different phone." She called 20 minutes later from a payphone outside a gas station in Priest River. What she told me lasted 4 minutes. When she was done, I sat at my kitchen table and understood that the situation had changed fundamentally. A no-bid contractor named Stillwater Marine had been awarded the marina build. Stillwater Marine was a Wyoming LLC incorporated 38 days before the bid. Its registered agent was a law office in Cheyenne. Its sole listed officer, behind 2 layers of holding companies, was a man named Tom Keller of Sandpoint, Idaho. The HOA had paid $2.2 million for a marina built on stolen land, awarded without competition to a shell company owned by the husband of the woman who had voted to approve the spending. In legal terms, that is called self-dealing. In federal terms, it is called wire fraud, mail fraud, and honest services fraud simultaneously. I opened a new tab in the binder. I labeled it in pencil, Federal. Gabriel Whitcomb arrived at my gate at 2 minutes past 8 the following Tuesday morning, driving a state truck with a cracked windshield and carrying a leather satchel that had to be older than I was. He was 72, white-haired, walked with a slight limp from a fall off a spillway in 1986, and knew more about earth dam hydraulics than any living engineer in the western United States. We walked the spillway together. He ran his hand along the concrete, noted the date stamp my grandfather had pressed into the wet pour. JHM, May 14th, 52. He measured the freeboard. He inspected the keyway, the seepage drains, the toe of the embankment. He took photographs. Then we walked to the pump house and he stopped at the door. "This is the original siphon." "Yes, sir, 6-inch line, inverted U over the embankment. Manual prime, gravity discharge to the creek bed. Tested every 2 years. Last test was 19 months ago. Discharge rate measured at 190 gallons per minute." He looked at me over his glasses. "I'm going to ask you a question, and you do not have to answer it. As the licensed dam operator, do you have any current concern about the structural integrity of this impoundment that would require an emergency drawdown to inspect and repair?" I looked at him for a long second. "Gabriel," I said, "I have a major unpermitted structure built into the impoundment, without engineering review, without freeboard analysis, without an Army Corps wetland sign-off, and without any consultation with the licensed operator. The pylons were driven without core sampling. As the licensed operator, I am obligated to perform a visual inspection of the embankment and bed under conditions of full drawdown." He wrote that down word for word. He signed his name at the bottom. He tore off the carbon copy and handed it to me. "Mr. Hollister, as the State Dam Safety Officer for District 5, I am authorizing an emergency drawdown of Junebug Pond at the licensed operator's discretion for the purpose of structural inspection. The drawdown must be coordinated with downstream notification and may proceed at any time within the next 90 days. State law preempts any private agreement that would interfere with this safety inspection. He folded his copy into the satchel. He shook my hand. Good luck, Wyatt. Your father would be proud. He climbed into his truck, then said one more thing through the open window. Funny thing about siphons, they don't make much noise. You can run one all night, and the only person who knows is the man at the valve. He drove off down the gravel. The next 2 weeks were the quietest I had lived in years. I worked methodically. Every morning I checked the trail cameras. Every afternoon I added pages to the binder. Every evening I sat at the kitchen table going through the damn construction documents until I had memorized the discharge schedule by heart. On a Wednesday, I called the FBI field office in Coeur d'Alene and asked to speak with the agent who handled public corruption tips. I was on the phone with Special Agent Eleanor Wexler for 98 minutes.
I emailed her 7 attachments: the marina permits, the Stillwater Marine corporate filings, the HOA assessment vote, the contractor invoices, Tom Keller's planning commission disclosure forms, the no-bid waiver, and the bank routing data Margaret had pulled from the public ledger of municipal payments. Agent Wexler called back the next morning and used the word actionable. She asked me to keep building the file and to call her the moment Diane took any further enforcement action. She said the Bureau preferred to act on a complete record. I told her I expected an opportunity to deliver one within 30 days. I called Jet and asked him to bring a post-hole digger on Friday. We spent 6 hours putting up new signs along the entire shoreline: private property, Hollister family estate, no trespassing, no commercial access, and marked the survey line with orange ribbon every 20 feet.
We posted notice that the parcel was an active state-licensed dam impoundment subject to drawdown without further warning to non-permitted occupants. I called my downstream neighbor, Owen Tesmer, who runs 40 head of cattle on the bottomland that catches the Spillway Creek, and told him what I was about to do and when. I asked him to keep his livestock off the lower meadow for 36 hours. He laughed for about a minute. Then he said, "Wyatt, I'll buy you a steak when you're done." I called Hannah. I told her in plain terms what I was going to do and why. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Daddy, Mom would have wanted you to do this. Open the valve." Diane must have sensed something, the way a coyote senses a wind shift. In the last 2 weeks before the regatta, she came at me 3 times, and each move was uglier than the one before. She filed a harassment complaint with the Bonner County Sheriff, alleging that I had stalked her on her dock, made threatening gestures, and used intimidating eye contact toward HOA volunteers. A deputy I'd known since high school, a man named Hal Lawson, drove out to my porch on a Tuesday afternoon with the complaint and a tired expression. When he finished reading it to me, he closed the folder. "Wyatt, you and I both know this is nothing, but she's filed 3 of these in the last 6 months on 3 different residents. I have to record that I came out and spoke with you." "Hal," I said, "I have 12 trail cameras and a binder thick enough to use as a doorstop. The only thing that's going to happen on my land in the next 10 days is whatever the lake decides to do." He looked at me for a moment. "Anything you want me to know ahead of time?" I told him to be at the marina at 8:30 Saturday morning in uniform and to bring a second deputy.
I told him there would not be a fight, there would be a story worth witnessing, and I would feel better if a man I trusted was on the gravel. He nodded once and drove off. 3 days later, I came back from town to find all 4 tires on my truck slashed. Clean cuts. A pocket knife job. A folded HOA notice was tucked under my windshield wiper, advising me I was in violation of the Lakeshore Pines Vehicle Aesthetic Ordinance. The trail camera on the gate post had captured the entire thing. A teenage kid in a Lakeshore Pines polo shirt, hoodie pulled up, knife in hand, moving from tire to tire while looking over his shoulder. The kid was Diane's 17-year-old son, Brock Keller. The footage was time-stamped, GPS tagged, and 4 kinds of clean.
I drove into Sandpoint on the spare and bought 4 new tires. I added the footage to the binder. Then came Tom's final move.
A certified letter arrived on Thursday afternoon, 2 days before the regatta, on Bonner County Planning Commission letterhead, signed by Tom Keller, Vice Chair. It informed me that the commission had voted in a session I was never notified of to commence an administrative review of my water rights on June Bug Pond. It stated that my dam license might be subject to revocation pending that review, under a section of code that did not exist. It demanded I appear at a special hearing the following Wednesday and bring all documentation related to my use of the impoundment for the past 45 years. In plain English, make trouble for the marina and we take your dam, your lake, and your grandfather's life work through bureaucratic process. I read the letter 3 times. I made a copy for the binder. I scanned it and emailed it to Special Agent Wexler with a subject line that read, "Attempted intimidation of federal witness re public corruption investigation." Wexler called back inside an hour, her voice completely calm.
"Mr. Hollister, would you object if a federal agent attended your Saturday event?" I said I would not object. I said I would prefer it. She said, "We will be there." The Founders Day Regatta was scheduled for the second Saturday in November. 48 invited guests. 12 out-of-state real estate investors flown in for the weekend. 3 county commissioners, 2 state senators, a live band on a barge, a catered seafood dinner at $500 per plate donated to the Lakeshore Pines Founders Endowment, a fund Diane had created to install permanent statuary of the original founders of Lakeshore Pines along the shoreline. Founders plural of an HOA that had existed for 16 months. Friday evening, I drove down to the dock at 6. I checked the gauge. I walked the spillway one more time. The water was glass, cold enough that my breath hung over it like cigarette smoke. I went into the pump house.
I closed the inflow valve from the spring inlet, the small one my grandfather had wired in so the lake could be isolated from its source. I opened the prime line on the siphon, primed the inverted U with a hand pump, held the handle steady. I felt the line jump as the water column took hold. I opened the discharge valve at 6:41 in the evening, just as the moon cleared the eastern ridge. The line gulped once, hard, like a man taking a deep breath. Then I heard the steady, sustained rush of 190 gallons of cold November lake water moving through 6 inches of pipe and out into the spillway creek bed below the embankment. I closed the pump house door. I walked up to the house. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table with the binder open in front of me, and I waited. 18 acres, average depth 9 feet. Total volume roughly 53 million gallons. At 190 gallons per minute, the math was clean. By sunrise, the pond would be down 7.5 feet. By mid-morning, it would be mud across most of its bed. By the time Diane Keller's first guest pulled into the marina parking lot, Junebug Pond would be a memory. I did not sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen window and watched the moon track across the eastern sky. Around 2 in the morning, I walked down to the spillway in the cold and listened. The siphon was running, steady as a held organ note. The discharge creek below the embankment was full and rushing where it had been a trickle at sundown. I shined my headlamp at the gauge post. The water was already 4 feet below the spring mark. The sky went pale at 6:50. By 7, the first orange streaks hit the ridge. I stepped onto the porch and walked down the gravel toward the water. What I saw stopped me in the road. Junebug Pond was gone. In its place was a vast, glistening basin of cracked clay and exposed lakebed. 18 acres of dark gray mud running edge to edge under a thin morning fog. The marina pier, 200 feet of poured concrete and aluminum framing, hung suspended from its pylons 15 feet above the bottom, like a child's model held up by stilts. The finger docks tilted at angles, some collapsed into the muck. The 2-story pavilion, designed to overhang the water by 12 feet, now floated in mid-air over dry shore. And there were boats. 12 boats, wedged into the mud, at angles God never designed any boat to sit at. a pontoon on its side, a cabin cruiser keeled over with its hull cracked, a wellcraft on its bow with the propellers in the air, a bass boat half buried with its outboard engines sunk to the block. $40,000 yachts and $100,000 pleasure craft, all of them sitting in stinking lakebed silt that had not seen sunlight in 73 years. The smell hit me a second after the sight. Cold, rotting algae, old freshwater muck, the mineral tang of submerged limestone, the sour vegetable bite of decomposing pondweed, the smell of a lake skeleton. The first car arrived at 7:52, a Pearl Lexus. A man in a Patagonia vest stepped out, walked 20 feet toward the pavilion, stopped, and stood very still for about 4 seconds. Then he got back in the car and sat with both hands on the wheel. By 8:15, 23 vehicles had pulled into the lot. The string quartet from Spokane stood near the gazebo with their instrument cases unopened. The catering truck was offloading silver chafing dishes onto a folding table that overlooked nothing but mud. 2 state senators stood at the pavilion railing with their drinks in hand and their mouths slightly open. Diane Keller arrived at 8:28, white wool coat over a navy dress, hair set, makeup perfect. She walked from her Range Rover to the edge of the pavilion deck without breaking stride, looked over the railing, and stopped. I watched her from the gravel rise above the gate with Jed beside me and Hal Lawson's patrol cruiser parked 20 feet away. I had a folder under my arm. I was wearing the brown canvas jacket my father bought me in 1989. The dog was at my heel. She stood at that railing looking at the mud where her marina was supposed to be, and the wind moved her hair, and her face went through 3 colors in about 10 seconds. Pale, then red, then a kind of waxy yellow that made her look hollow. Then she turned, found me in the crowd, and started walking. Hard, brisk stride that broke into a half-run by the time she reached the gate. "What did you do?" she said. Loud now, loud enough that the string quartet stopped pretending to tune. "What did you do to my lake?" "Mrs. Keller," I said, "I performed an authorized emergency drawdown of a state-licensed dam impoundment with the written authorization of the Idaho Department of Water Resources, dated October 14th. I am the licensed operator. The drawdown was conducted pursuant to a structural inspection mandate. Notice was provided to all downstream water users." "This is my marina," she said. Her voice was breaking. "This is $2 million of construction. You destroyed my lake." "It is not your lake," I said. "It has never been your lake. The deed is in my name and was in my father's name and my grandfather's before that. The dam is licensed to me. The water rights are vested in my parcel. The marina you built is a trespass. As for what I destroyed, I did not destroy anything. I temporarily relocated water that belongs to me to a downstream creek bed. The water will return when I open the spring inlet. The marina is yours to remove." That was when the second vehicle pulled into the lot, a black Ford Explorer with federal plates. 2 agents in dark windbreakers stepped out. A third followed in a separate sedan. Special Agent Eleanor Wexler walked straight across the parking lot and identified herself in a voice that carried across the entire lot. "Diane Keller, Tom Keller, I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of wire fraud, mail fraud, honest services fraud, and bid rigging in connection with the contract awarded to Stillwater Marine. You have the right to remain silent." Tom Keller had just walked out of the pavilion in a navy blazer with a champagne flute in his hand. He dropped it when he heard his name. The glass rolled off the deck and fell 15 feet to the mud below. It didn't break. It just settled into the silt. The string quartet put their instruments back in their cases. The catering crew stopped unloading. The 2 state senators set their drinks on the railing very carefully and walked in step to their car. Ellis Reed from the Sandpoint paper was already there. He had arrived at 7:30. His photographer had been on the bluff above the gate since 6 in the morning. They had 140 photographs of the entire morning, including the moment Tom Keller was placed in handcuffs in front of the burnt-edge Lakeshore Pines Marina archway. Diane was led across the parking lot in her white wool coat with her wrists behind her back.
As she passed me at the gate, she stopped. She looked at me with an expression I will carry the rest of my life. Not anger anymore, but the pure, total, uncomprehending confusion of a person who has spent so long believing the world will arrange itself around her will that she genuinely cannot process the moment it doesn't. She said, "But it was just a lake." I said, "No, ma'am, it was my grandfather." I closed the discharge valve at noon. By that afternoon, I had reopened the spring inlet, and the slow business of refilling Junebug Pond began. A spring-fed lake of 18 acres takes about 4 months to recover its full pool. I sat on the bench every morning with coffee and watched the level rise. An inch, then 2, then a foot. The loons came back in February. By the time the dogwoods bloomed in May, Junebug Pond was full to the freeboard mark my grandfather had carved into the cedar gauge post in 1953. The marina did not survive the spring thaw. The pylons, driven without core sampling and stressed by months of unsupported load, cracked at the waterline when the level rose around them. The HOA's insurance carrier denied every claim, citing fraudulent permits. By June, the marina was a half-floating, half-sunken pile of warped timber and broken concrete. The receiver appointed by the federal court ordered the entire structure removed at HOA expense. Diane Keller pleaded out the following October. 18 months in federal custody, 3 years of supervised release, full restitution to the 42 homeowners who had paid the special assessment, and a permanent ban from holding any officer position in any homeowners association in any state for the remainder of her life. Tom Keller received 30 months. Stillwater Marine was dissolved. The Bonner County Planning Commission revised its no-bid waiver process entirely. The 42 Lakeshore Pines homeowners were, to be fair, mostly decent people who had trusted the wrong board. 29 of them came to my house in the months following the arrests, in 2s and 3s, to apologize. One brought a bottle of bourbon that had been in his father's cabinet for 40 years. I shook every hand. I told each of them that the lake had room for honest neighbors, and that the gate was open to anyone who walked up to it carrying a fishing rod and a quiet voice. Hannah came home for Christmas. We sat on the bench by the water in the cold and watched the moon rise over the eastern ridge. She held my hand. She told me her mother would have laughed for an hour. In the spring, I sat down with Gabriel Whitcomb, with Owen Tesmer, and with a young attorney from a land trust in Sandpoint, and we drew up the documents to place a permanent conservation easement on the entire 18-acre lake and the surrounding 40 acres of shoreline. The easement was donated to the Idaho Fish and Wildlife Foundation. The terms were simple. The lake stays in the Hollister family during my lifetime, then passes into a public conservation trust, with one condition. It must be used for one purpose, free of charge, every summer Saturday from June through August. A children's fishing program. Up to 30 kids per Saturday. Local kids, foster kids, kids from any background. Free rods, free bait, free instruction, free lemonade. We named the program after my wife. The Junebug Saturdays. The first Junebug Saturday was held the second weekend of June. 28 kids showed up. Hannah ran the check-in table. Jed ran the casting station. I stood on the bench by the water with the dog at my side and watched a 7-year-old boy with a missing front tooth land his first bluegill. The sound he made when that fish broke the surface. The pure, unstoppable shout of a child who has just discovered something wonderful was the best sound I had heard in 3 years. That is how the story ended. $2.2 million of stolen marina gone. A corrupt HOA president and her commissioner husband in federal custody. A lake my grandfather built with a wheelbarrow, restored to its rightful owner, and dedicated to children who will never have to ask anyone's permission to fish on a free piece of water. Here is what I want you to take from all of this. And it has nothing to do with drama or revenge or watching things fall apart for people who deserved it. It has to do with the one thing that made all of it possible. Diane Keller fell not because someone was louder than her, or angrier than her, or had more political connections. She fell because she assumed the quiet man at the end of the road was just an old widower with a fishing pole and nothing left to fight for. When in fact, he was a 31-year Army Corps civil engineer with a state dam license, a green folder of original documents, and the patience of a man who has already lost the most important person in his life and has nothing left that scares him. Document everything. Know what you own. Make the right phone calls instead of the loud ones. Understand that the law works for the person who builds the record, not the person who makes the noise. And remember that the water in the end goes where the water goes, regardless of what anyone writes on HOA letterhead. The lake came back. The kids fish on it every Saturday. And somewhere in Idaho, on a June morning, a child is going to land her first fish on water a developer once tried to steal. If you have ever been bullied by a board, pushed off land that was yours by someone who thought a clipboard outranked a deed, I want to hear your story. Drop it in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And until then, keep your records, know your land, and never forget which one of you is holding the valve.